My son, you are having nightmares. From the past, hardships will follow, along with betrayal. But during your trial, you will grow stronger. You will fight for those you love. And when all seems lost, the sleeping dragon within you will awaken. Dragon King Chronicles, a new isekai.
Sleeping Dragon King Chronicles by Kenneth Flanders Jr. Narrated by Peter Widener. Chapter 0, Futures Past.
It's time. Are you ready?
The young Nikomata asked, her ears twitching beneath her hooded cloak. She was speaking to a young man who was sitting near the edge of a cliff, gazing out across the distance. For a moment, he didn't show any sign of acknowledgement. Perhaps he was pulled into the beauty of the sunset, the crimson and gold colors that only heaven can provide prior to dusk. In actuality, the young man, though his body was still and calm, struggled with racing thoughts. His heart was brimming with the vibrancy of raw emotion. His feelings were like a torrent, his eyes filled with a dangerous energy and hardened resolve. Thoughts of blood, tears, and anguish bubbled up within his heart and burst forth, painting vivid memories of those he'd lost along the way.
You're a lot like me. You hold in a great deal because you've never felt safe enough to be yourself. It's okay. Just let it out.
The young man clenched his fists as tears began to wet his cheeks, the soft breeze cooling his face in the process.
You always cry, and that's okay. But just for once, really make an effort. I know you can do it, because I used to be just like you.
The young man got to his feet, wiping a solitary tear from his cheek as he pulled the hood of his cloak down across his shoulders. Yeah, let's go. Chapter 1, Waking Sleep.
Ryuga!
The voice of a woman could be heard screaming, her voice piercing the darkness, though her face was shrouded by darkness. Ryuga could easily discern her identity. It was a person he could never forget, one his mind drifted to with every still moment of the day. Mother! Mother! The young boy reached out, his hands outstretched as the jaws of a large, ominous creature closed in. It was the same dream, lingering memories that often played out in his psyche. He'd had enough, or rather, his heart did. The blaring sound of his alarm clock became more prominent, and soon the young man's eyes popped open. Rays of sunlight filtered through the cracks of his bedroom window, bringing upon him the slow realization that morning had finally come. I hate dreaming, he whispered to himself as he sat up in bed. There he remained motionless for quite some time as he attempted to quiet the stirring emotions now mingling within his heart. Anger, sadness, regret. These feelings piled themselves on until he could do little else but get his day started, as he always did. Breakfast first, always breakfast, then a shower and rush to get dressed. Even with a leisurely pace, he always had extra time to linger about. So much like any other school day, the boy known as Ryuga decided to switch on his television to watch the news. He took his place at the kitchen table, as he often did, and pulled out a crossword puzzle, one of the many he'd often kept stashed in his coat pocket. He could hear his classmate, Gates, in the back of his mind. "Old man," the customary remark each time Ryuga pulled a crossword out in front of his fellow students. This made him smile a bit, just for a moment. Soon he was on his way. He double-checked before setting out. Backsack, uniform complete, a packed lunch. As he walked to his front door, he paused for a moment, turning to face a picture on the nearby counter. Ryuga bowed his head, offering up a prayer for the dark-haired, bright-eyed woman who was smiling so carefree in the photograph. She was the focal point of the picture, although there was another person with their arm draped over her shoulder. His face was ripped away by the edge. Just the thought of that bastard made Ryuga's blood boil. But this anger only lasted a brief moment as his thoughts turned to his mother once more. "Bye, Mom," Ryuga said, a solemn and sad expression on his face as he swung his overcoat over his shoulder and exited his home. Within minutes, Ryuga was on his way, as were most of the teens in his area. The school wasn't very far, so he and the others from his neighborhood walked to their destination. Along the way, he saw the usual suspects. Linda, a blonde-haired foreign exchange student who was well liked by her classmates. As usual, she had a large group of girls surrounding her. Ryuga called these girls the Hive, with Linda as the queen bee at the center. Next was Ichigo, a tall, skinny boy who wore glasses, and his good friend Gates, a short, warm-hearted, and friendly teen. Gates, whose real name was Ryuji, had been Ichigo's friend since Ryuga could remember. Because the two of them shared such a similar name, Ryuga and Ryuji, everyone in the class called Ryuji by his last name. And then there was Tarad. Tarad was your typical jock, big on brawn, but small on intellect. Like most days, Ryuga just pulled his headset over his ears and continued on his way, ignoring everyone and everything on his way to school. In virtually no time, Ryuga and the others were entering the large gates of their school, Garden Haven Academy. Though the school was considered normal by all standards, it had a reputation for creating students who would go on to excel in life. As such, it had many amenities that other schools would be hard-pressed to obtain. As the students settled into 3A, the homeroom class for Ryuga and his classmates, Ryuga immediately took note of the 2 extra desks in the back row. He thought to himself, just seconds before the teacher entered the room, in tow with 2 new additions to the classroom. "Attention, class," Miss Konami began. "Today we have not 1, but 2 new transfer students. 3A is really growing, Miss Konami was a young lady in her early 20s. Her heart-shaped face was framed by circular spectacles and a jovial smile most times. Her short, bowl-cut hair made her head resemble something of an acorn, which is why many of the students in the class called her Acorn Queen behind her back. Ryuga, however, had no problem with Miss Konami, as she had always been kind to him, perhaps a bit too kind for his liking at times. "First up is Akira. Akira, please introduce yourself," Miss Konami added. Of the 2 students, the young girl known as Akira stepped forward. Her skin was fair, her hair jet black and shiny. In fact, it was the first thing Ryuga noticed about her. Next were her sky blue eyes. They had a peculiar look to them. It was as if he was staring into a kaleidoscope of colors. Immediately, he was drawn into them. Then, their gazes met. It was like a jolt of energy tingling from within. Ryuga became lost for just an instant. He was completely disarmed in that moment as Akira smiled gently, forcing Ryuga to blush. He quickly bowed his head in an attempt to avert his gaze. Just then, the impact of a shock to the side of his desk jolted Ryuga back into reality.
Don't get carried away, loser. A girl like that would never be interested in you.
It was Jin, one of Tarad's jock buddies. He was one of the people who formed what Ryuga liked to call the Jockstrap Squad. They ate together, harassed and bullied people together. They probably even took shits together. This thought caused a creepy smile to spread across Ryuga's face, which in turn won another insult from a confused Jin.
Creep. Ugh.
While daydreaming, Ryuga had managed to completely miss Akira's introduction. Next up was the other transfer student. His name was David Jones, a short, chubby kid from America. His face was boyish, which, by extension, made him seem much younger than he really was. The fact that he had freckles also didn't help.
Well, 1 out of 2 isn't so bad. 1 beauty, 1 more nerd,
Jin whispered to his nearby associates. It was true. David's demeanor, face, really everything about him, did paint him as an archetype nerd. The two students took their place in the back row of the classroom before Miss Konami continued. Linda, I'd like you to show our two newest additions around for the remainder of the day and help them out. As class representative, it falls upon you.
Got it, Miss Konami.
Linda said with a beaming smile. How fake, Ryuga thought to himself. She's always like this, two-faced. The day's lesson was much like any other. Ryuga often spent his time staring out of the window, and today was no exception. However, he couldn't help but find his mind drawn to the new student Akira. Occasionally, he would turn to sneak a peek at her. More often than not, Jin's smug face would be there attempting to cockblock, but every now and then, Akira would also be staring in his direction. Each time she would smile, forcing Ryuga to blush as well. Ryuga wasn't really the romantic type. More often than not, he would prefer to choose a vantage point to observe others rather than get involved in class politics. Things were better, simpler that way. After observing the flow of the classroom, there were basically three groups of people with any measure of influence: the jocks, the queens, and the used. Ryuga fell into group number 3. The jocks and queens were pretty self-explanatory, but the used? Well, that was a bit different. Essentially, as long as you could provide some service or function to either group, you'd be left alone to a certain degree. Or rather, your experience would be more pleasant. Because Ryuga was positioned next to Jin, and Jin was as dumb as a box of rocks, it put Ryuga in a position to be useful. By allowing Jin to take his homework, Ryuga actually made copies and pretended like Jin was pulling one over on him to inflate Jin's ego. Jin could obtain passing grades. Because Jin could pass tests without studying, Ryuga was able to navigate his school life without much trouble, which is exactly how he liked it. These three social groups were sort of like an unspoken hierarchy. Everyone else was just considered normies. And while Ryuga had the mental acuity to navigate this social hierarchy, he simply refrained from doing so. There were many times he'd been approached after having been deemed cool enough, but there was just something that didn't sit right with Ryuga. They just, all of them, seemed so basic. Perhaps it was due to the level of maturity. Ryuga simply couldn't bring himself to care about the things other students his age were worried over. Perhaps it was due to the fact that their home lives were very different. Everyone else had mothers, fathers, brothers, and sisters. Ryuga had empty halls and bedrooms, memories that haunted him in the night, regrets, and only pictures to see him off in the morning. His thoughts were wandering into a territory he didn't want to venture, so he decided to change his line of thought. I wonder what group Akira will fall into, he whispered to himself as he gazed out of the window to his left. He wasn't looking at anything in particular. Perhaps he was wishing the sky would open and take him away. Maybe he was seeking some answer for the circumstances of his life. Maybe he just wanted to be as light and weightless as a cloud. Soon it was lunchtime, and Ryuga would have an answer as to his earlier ponderance.
Hello.
Ryuga was staring out of the window when a female voice pulled him from his thoughts. Hi, oh, hello. Ryuga was surprised to see that Akira was standing next to his desk, a pleasant smile on her face. I noticed you staring out of the window quite often. Is there something interesting out there? Akira said as she leaned over his desk and peered out of the window. No, Ryuga said as his face grew flushed slightly. A sweet-smelling scent wafted over, and though he couldn't place it, Ryuga recognized it as floral. Oh, okay. Well, I just wanted to say hello. I'm Akira, as you know, Akira said as she took a couple of steps back to correct her balance. Ryuga. Oh, I like that name, Akira said as their eyes met once more. Ryuga couldn't put his finger on it, but it was as if her gaze was slowly pulling him in.
Akira!
Linda's voice pierced the air, completely interrupting the mood.
Let's go have lunch,
she said, grabbing Akira by the arm and dragging her away before she could even respond.
Okay,
Akira said as she turned to wave to Ryuga.
Don't even think about it, loser.
Tarad's deep voice growled as he stepped in front of Ryuga. Their eyes met as Ryuga gazed upwards. Something about their eye contact seemed to agitate Tarad. Perhaps it was due to the fact that he could tell Ryuga didn't genuinely care one way or the other about his intimidation tactics.
Freak. You and your creepy eyes.
Tarad said as he folded his arms and turned around to walk out of the classroom with his usual bunch. Ryuga grunted to himself. Truthfully, the last thing on his mind was Tarad or Linda. Even Akira wasn't enough to fully distract his mind, or his heart. 4 days, Ryuga muttered to himself as sadness washed over him while he continued to gaze at the clouds. Chapter 2. Get in where you fit in. As expected, David was rebuffed as he attempted to get Linda to show him around. Not enough coolness points, I suppose, Ryuga thought to himself as he watched the spectacle. In general, the queens were surrounded by the jocks, who acted as sort of a hovering royal guard. Any male who didn't meet the requirements for coolness, as labeled by either group, would be intimidated and possibly beaten into retreat. Somehow, Akira had made her way squarely into the middle of the hornet's nest. In fact, it seemed as if both groups were actively fighting to impress her. Ryuga watched intently for the entirety of the first day as the queen bee regaled Akira with her exploits. Ryuga observed no less than 5 switch-ups in a single conversation. He was convinced that Akira was doing it on purpose to keep the others guessing. Occasionally, as if she could feel his gaze, Akira would steal a glance towards him, always a warm smile on her face as she did so. This in turn ignited a fuzzy spark in Ryuga's chest, but unfortunately, this was usually soured by overwhelming malice being directed his way from the other boys, particularly the jocks. Geez, we're only 15, 16? What's with all the drama? Ryuga would think to himself. Still, he couldn't help but feel secretly pleased. Even Tarad seemed annoyed, and he was known for his cool demeanor, even when he was harassing others. By day 3, it was pretty clear that Akira had absolutely no intention of boxing herself into just one social clique. She would involve herself with Linda during the morning, speak to Ryuga every day before lunch, and occasionally after school, and hang out with both the jocks and the queens after class. And strangely enough, it had become the new norm. This was probably due to the fact that this forced grouping was never actually spoken about. There were no conscious conversations about it, so the subject of choosing was difficult to breach in passing. Perhaps it was simply due to the fact that Akira herself showed absolutely no desire to belong to anyone. In fact, the only person she actively showed an interest in was Ryuga. Of all the people in the class, he was the only one she would take time out of her day to interact with. Their conversations were always short, but meaningful. During their chats, Akira had managed to learn his middle name, his favorite hobby, reading, and that he was an only child. These weren't necessarily closely guarded secrets. Rather, because he kept to himself, and often rebuffed anyone who tried to get too close, no one in the class knew much of anything about Ryuga in general. On the 3rd day, while on his way home, Ryuga was followed by Tarad and his group, who waited until he turned a corner to accost him.
Hey, look who it is.
Tarad said so emphatically that Ryuga could imagine the sneer on his face. Still, Ryuga paid him no mind and kept walking.
Hey, I know you hear me, you little scrub.
Tarad said, placing his hand on Ryuga's shoulder, the same hand that was quickly slapped away as Ryuga kept walking.
You little shit! Watch yourself!
Benji, the 3rd man in Tarad's jockstrap squad, screamed as he lunged forward. Benji pushed Ryuga hard into a nearby wall, pressing his face against the cold concrete before flipping him around forcefully.
Tarad wants to talk to you! Don't go ignoring him!
It takes 4 people to talk to me? Sounds like Tarad's got a codependency problem, Ryuga retorted. He wasn't exactly sure why he said it in a time like this. It was obvious what was to come, but before the words could be corralled, they were spoken.
What the hell did you just say?
Benji said as he reared back to punch Ryuga.
Stop. I'll handle this.
Tarad said, stepping forward as he pushed Benji to the side.
Don't get beside yourself just because she makes an effort to talk to you. She's just being nice, you little twerp. If you know it's good for you, you'll keep your hands to yourself.
Tarad said, a stern look upon his face. Ryuga didn't respond or even register that he acknowledged Tarad in any way. Instead, he simply stared. Tarad wasn't really sure what he saw in Ryuga's eyes that annoyed him, but there was something about this kid that really agitated him. Just his face. It was like he didn't understand or observe the pecking order. He'd let Ryuga slide because he thought the boy understood to a degree, but perhaps it was time to teach him a lesson. Tarad turned to leave, but it was a feint. Instead, he reared back to catch Ryuga off guard with a swift, powerful punch to the gut. Ryuga was completely unprepared, the blow sinking deep into his abdomen and knocking the air out of him.
You little shit! I'll show you exactly where you stand with me.
As Ryuga fought to catch his breath, Tarad hit him with a powerful cross which knocked him first to his knees and then to the ground, face first. Tarad followed up with several kicks to the abdomen, adding insult to injury as the pain overcame Ryuga so badly that he thought he'd pass out.
Don't break anything. Just bruise him up. Really bad.
Tarad said as he stepped back and put his hands into his pockets. The other 3 jockstraps stepped forward and began stomping and kicking Ryuga, who was forced to curl up into fetal position. Several minutes later, Ryuga was barely conscious, his face and arms badly swollen, blood seeping from lacerations and cuts on his hands and arms. Ryuga could scarcely keep his eyes open as he watched the group walk off, leaving him bruised and battered. Soon, he could no longer keep his eyes open, his body racked with pain from head to toe as he succumbed to weariness. Usually, his mind was a place Ryuga dreaded to descend into, but there, in this time of discomfort, he found solace. He could hear her voice, his mother's voice, and though he couldn't make out her words, he had a feeling she was saying something along the lines of, "It will be okay, honey." Ryuga wasn't really sure how long he'd been out, but he remembered waking up with the taste of blood in his mouth. His legs felt decent, much less like jelly now, and though his abdomen was still bruised and battered, he could now find the strength to stand. He grabbed up his belongings and started the long, painful walk home. His eye was swollen from where Tarad struck him initially, and his ribcage ached with each step. Still, more than pain, what Ryuga felt was anger. It flickered within him like a dancing flame, so much so that unbeknownst to Ryuga, his eyes began to take on a peculiar countenance, almost lizard-like appearance. It was normally a 10-minute walk from his home to the school, but today it was well over an hour due to the snail's pace Ryuga was forced to keep. Each step was riddled with pain, which shot forth from every part of his body as he moved. The only thing keeping him on his feet at this point was the desire to make it home. Once he'd entered his house, he could do little else but fall over at his doorstep. He'd expended all of his energy simply getting to the house, but his mind was still racing. Something about the encounter had sent his heart aflutter. It was a different type of emotion, one that he'd never experienced before. Though his body was battered, he felt as if his soul was on fire. Those same classmates, the ones he'd regularly looked down upon for being immature, had ignited within him a sense of being alive, something that Ryuga had given up long ago. At this thought, he turned his head to look up at the picture of his mother, sitting by his front door as always. Her face carried him through many days, and the memories he'd held of her were his only solace through dark times. For him, loneliness was a constant companion. He'd already died inside, and never quite found a way to live or feel again. In fact, he was only alive now because it was a directive from his mother. She wished for him to live on, no matter what. But Ryuga couldn't deny that his days often felt like staring into a spiraling abyss of darkness. A deep and all-consuming hole that swallowed all hope, all protest, and all will to push on. For him, this reality was much more surreal than the pain which seared through his body. No physical pain could compare to the trauma that had been inflicted to his soul. He placed his hand over his eyes as the tears welled up and began to pour. It had been a while since he'd cried to himself like this. No hope. At least, that's what he thought to himself. Still, he couldn't help but think of Akira's face the second this thought creeped into his mind. Was he fooling himself, as Tarad said? Was Akira really just being nice to him out of pity? Ryuga's life was heavy enough. The real reason he sought to be alone was because he didn't like the weight of the chains others often seek to place upon each other. He struggled with so much, it wasn't worth adding any more weight to an encumbered existence. He finally got to his feet after a good cry and slowly walked towards his bathroom, lost in thought. Should he just ignore her altogether tomorrow? A part of him thought this might be a good idea, but a larger part of him really wanted to deprive Tarad of the pleasure it would bring. A part of him wanted to blatantly rebuke Tarad by flirting in his face. This was also a feeling he couldn't deny. Deep within, there was a certain degree of defiance which was beginning to churn in his stomach. Either way, he would have at least a day to settle his feelings on the matter. Ryuga finished washing his hands and stared into the mirror, deep in thought. For a moment, he didn't recognize the eyes gazing back, but upon doing a double take, he dismissed it as fatigue. It was only 6 p.m, but Ryuga had a long day ahead of him tomorrow. With this in mind, he decided on a simple instant dinner. Then he said his prayers and retired to his bedroom, a deep sleep overcoming him almost as soon as he closed his eyes. Chapter 3. Just a day. Just an ordinary day. Ryuga slapped the button on his alarm clock and sat up in bed. It was rare that he had a good night's sleep without the stress of nightmares, but his subconscious saw fit to give him respite. Maybe I should get into fights more often, he thought to himself as he stretched his body. All that lingered was a bit of soreness in his stomach and jaw. The remainder of his injuries were gone for the most part. This was nothing new to Ryuga, and he didn't think twice about it. It was as common to him as breathing. He got dressed and prepared for school, prayed and said goodbye to his mother, then made his way to class as usual. There were a plethora of things on his mind. Strangely enough, none of them in regards to his being attacked by his classmates. Mostly, Ryuga thought about his finances. He wondered if he'd have enough money to do what he needed to later on today. This thought consumed him as he made his way to class.
Yeah, man, we put that little clown in his place. He won't be able to walk straight for weeks. He'll think twice now before talking to your girl, Tarad,
Benji said as he chuckled and joked with Tarad. The 4 jocks were huddled around Tarad's desk as usual every morning.
Oh, Tarad's got a girl? Who is it?
Akira asked as she put her fingertip against her lips quizzically.
Oh, no one.
Benji said sheepishly, unaware that Akira had been within earshot.
Akira.
Tarad said with a slight smile.
Hello, Tarad.
Akira noticed someone entering the classroom.
Oh, Ryuga. Hey.
Akira said, completely ignoring Tarad and instead choosing to meet Ryuga at the doorway.
Oh, hey, Akira. How are you this morning?
Ryuga said, immediately feeling eyes upon him.
What the fuck? How is he even here right now? Do you see him? He looks untouched.
Benji whispered to Jin.
Dude, there's no way. He should be half dead or something.
Jin whispered back. Tarad's mouth gaped open for a moment before he was overtaken by a wave of jealousy. Akira and Ryuga carried on their conversation all the way to his seat. Tarad and his crew's gaze remained glued to their every movement.
Ryuga, Linda and a few other people are planning to hang out after class today. Would you like to come along?
Akira asked as she sat down in Jin's seat, across the way from Ryuga's desk.
I can't today. I've got some plans.
Ryuga replied as he put his belongings down on his desk and took his seat.
Oh, They said you'd say that. Are you too good to hang out with me, Ryuga?
Akira asked, pouting a bit.
No.
Ryuga couldn't help but laugh. He wondered if Akira really knew the true face of the people she was inviting him to hang out with. He also wondered if she'd still be so amicable if she knew what happened yesterday. He had no doubt that Linda was an instigator in having Ryuga roughed up.
It's nothing like that. It's actually a personal matter,
Ryuga said with a faint smile.
Oh? Does someone have a girlfriend? A super secret girlfriend?
Akira drew extremely close as she spoke. Her face was centimeters from his, so close in fact that the others in the classroom might actually think they were kissing.
No, actually, I need to go visit my mom's grave later.
Ryuga finally relented. He was always hesitant to tell anyone about his situation, but within the past 3 days, Akira had learned more about him than anyone in his class. Was it truly okay? Somewhere in the back of his mind, Ryuga wondered if there was some kind of weird popular girl initiation. Befriend the outcast, get him to spill his deepest, darkest secrets, then expose him for the sap he is. Perhaps it was his insecurity talking, but the lingering seeds of doubt planted by Tarid were definitely beginning to take root.
What's going on here?
Tarid seemed to come out of nowhere, placing his arm around Akira's shoulder.
You talking to my girl, bro?
Tarid said, a cheeky sneer on his face, which was quickly replaced when Akira slapped his arm off of her shoulders and straightened him out.
I don't ever remember saying I'd be your girl.
Please don't make that decision for me. Anyway, Ryuga and I are talking. You're interrupting. She was so direct that Tarid was left speechless. After several awkward seconds, he was forced to recover with an excuse.
Of course, I was just joking.
Tarid said dryly as he retreated back across the classroom to his seat.
Oh? Who's in a secret relationship now?
Ryuga said with a teasing chuckle and a huge smile.
Never. He's not my type
At all, Akira said as she waved her hand in a dismissing manner. Anyway,
I'm sorry. I didn't mean to bring up a subject you may not be comfortable talking about,
Akira began.
No, it's okay. It happened years ago. It's not really like it's some big secret,
Ryuga said as he reassured Akira.
But still, I know the feeling. My father, he just passed on recently. In fact, it's the reason for our move, so I can definitely understand what it's like to lose a loved one.
Ryuga couldn't help but clench his fist at the very word, father. What's a father? He caught himself and eased up a bit as he took note of the sadness now clouding Akira's face.
Akira,
Ryuga said softly.
What am I doing?
He thought to himself.
Doubting her because of what some douchebag said? Akira, I can't say it gets better. I still think about my mom every day.
Ryuga began as he took Akira by the hand.
But what I can promise is that eventually the pain you feel will be replaced by fond memories.
Akira seemed flustered by his sudden contact, but she didn't shy away.
Thank you, Ryuga. Well, I'm gonna go back to my seat now before class starts. Maybe we'll talk at lunch?
Akira quickly got to her feet and made her way back to her chair.
Was that my imagination, or did she just get flustered?
Ryuga thought to himself as Jin walked over to take his seat.
You little poser, marching in here like we didn't work you over yesterday? Don't think you're gonna get off light again.
Jin whispered, but Ryuga barely registered the goon's threats.
Kill yourself, underling,
Ryuga finally said, staring directly into Jin's eyes as he spoke. The words surprised even Ryuga himself, for they weren't planned. They just seemed to jump out of his body. It was almost as if someone else were speaking for him. Even Jin looked surprised at first, before his brow furrowed in anger.
You're fucking dead!
Jin started to bellow as he got to his feet.
Attention, class! Everyone take their seats. Class is starting.
Mrs. Konami's glare was directed right at Jin, who had little choice but to sink back into his seat, grumbling as he did so. Ryuga then shot a glance over at Tarid, whom he'd never seen so angry. A literal vein was popping in his forehead. Next, he glanced over at Linda, who seemed to be reevaluating her opinion of him on the spot. Finally, He glanced over at Akira, who seemed to be fidgeting in her seat a bit as she accidentally dropped her ink pen. Ryuga could do little else but sigh and smile. Somehow, he'd been roped into some weird classroom drama. Chapter 4. Just Trying to Get By. Ryuga was now on a train, headed back to his old hometown, Greenvale. The ride from Gardenvale, where he currently resided, to Greenvale was about an hour commute. He was worried about the price of the ticket initially, only to find out that his Aunt Sumiko had already paid for one in advance. It had been a whole year since he'd seen his aunt last, but time passed quickly. Considering all he'd been through, it felt like a paradox. Each day seemed to drag on. But when Ryuga looked back in retrospect, he felt as if time was desperately slipping away from him. Perhaps it was the price of constantly being a prisoner of his own thoughts. Ryuga could do little else but stare out of the window at the passing scenery as he made his way back home. Each year he was allowed to leave school early so that he could pay his respects to his mother's grave. Since the complete trip was over 2 hours in duration, his homeroom teacher, Mrs. Kanami, had taken to just giving Ryuga the entire afternoon off for the past 5 years since the custom started. Ryuga's thoughts bounced from his mother to his aunt and then to Akira in no particular order. Each woman embodied a different emotion: sadness, hope, and comfort. A strange trio of feelings which took turns assaulting his heart in various ways. On the best of days, Ryuga would fight with his emotions to avoid remembering something traumatic. But on this day, of all days, he could do little else. Thoughts of his mother's outstretched hands, her voice, her warmth, all of these sensations flooded back as vivid memories which both gave him peace and tormented him in equal measure. But still, this was the least he could do for his mother, and also for himself. To reaffirm his resolve to keep on living, no matter what life might throw at him. Soon he was at the train station, eagerly greeted by his aunt and his cousin Eiko. Eiko was always happy to see Ryuga, and greeted him with a running jump as usual. This brought a smile to his face. No matter how down he felt, it was nice to be wanted on some level, a feeling Ryuga had long forgotten. The trio were soon in the car and headed back to Sumiko's home. Eiko and Ryuga had a common bond in the fact that their fathers were absent. Unlike Ryuga, Eiko's father was a policeman who died in the line of duty just 2 years prior to Ryuga's mother and her incident. Back then, Ryuga remembered how nice it was to live in the same town as his aunt and cousin. They would see each other most every weekend. Eiko was more like his sister than anything, the sister he'd never had. In many ways, she was stronger than Ryuga. She would always cheer him up when he looked sad and reassure him, despite the fact that he could tell Eiko must be hurting too, longing for her father. Ryuga's father, on the other hand, brought him nothing but misery and anger. He couldn't even think straight at the thought of his father's face, much less hearing his name. Thus, this was a sore subject to be mentioned. After a good meal, the trio then hopped into the car and headed to the graveyard. Both Sumiko and Eiko bowed their heads to the grave marked Sumeraji Ichika, offering their respects. Young Eiko burst into tears, prompting Ryuga to console her a bit before the mother and daughter duo made themselves scarce to give the young man time alone.
So, another year has passed. That makes 5 years now? Maybe 4? I'm sorry. I can never remember. Please don't hold it against me, Mom.
Ryuga began as he searched for the words. Any words. He wasn't even sure if such a thing had meaning, but it felt right. It comforted him to come and share his thoughts and his life with his mother. So that is what he did.
So, you'll never believe it, but I think I met a girl who likes me. She's pretty nice. You'd probably like her. Her name is Akira. She's got really pretty eyes. They remind me of stained glass, or maybe a kaleidoscope. I'm not sure which. They are very deep. They pull you in. School is good. Mrs. Kanami is keeping an eye on me. Perhaps a bit too much. I'm staying out of trouble as best I can.
Ryuga paused for a moment as the words he truly wanted to share hit his heart.
I miss you, Mom. A lot. Every day. All the time. And I'm sorry. I'm sorry I was too young, too small to help you, to save you. That's actually an excuse.
Ryuga said as tears started to stream down his face.
The truth is, I should have run to you. I should have grabbed you and not let go. No matter what, I'd rather have died with you than spend another day here without you. But,
he said between tears,
I'm trying my best. I'll keep going. Because it's what you asked me to do. I love you.
After the words were spoken, all Ryuga could do was bow his head into his hands and let the tears flow. Whoever said the tears would stop eventually was a liar. They never stop. You just learn to cry on the inside. After spending more time with his aunt and cousin, Ryuga finally boarded his train to return to Gardenvale.
Oni-chan, take care. Come see us soon.
Eiko said as she gave Ryuga a big hug.
I'll try, for sure, Ai-chan.
Ryuga said as he patted her on the head.
Take care of Aunt Sumiko.
Ryuga then turned to give his aunt a hug. The pair saw him off as the train left the station, and he watched until they were little more than dots on the horizon. As Ryuga took a seat on the train, he realized how he had begun to feel better. His heart wasn't as heavy. He wasn't so encumbered after all. Right around the time this realization came to him, the train itself seemed to shudder and shake. There was a loud thud on the roof, causing the entire car to rattle. Ryuga was nearly thrown from his seat to the floor, while several other people actually lost their balance.
What the hell was that?
One elderly man screamed as passengers began to shout and scream in dismay. In the end, it seemed like an isolated incident. The remainder of the ride home went smoothly, and by 6:30 or so, Ryuga had made it back to the city of Gardenvale.
I really ought to visit more often,
he said to himself as he slowly made his way home. It was Saturday, so there would be no school tomorrow. For the first time, in a long time, Ryuga felt the urge to do something, anything, to be social, to connect. His mind immediately flashed back to Akira's invitation earlier in the day. If he had had her number, he'd have maybe given her a call, but no such luck. At times like this, he cursed his own antisocial policies. In the end, he decided to head towards the arcade. He had a little change from his gracious Aunt Sumiko, so he decided to splurge a little. Along the way, Ryuga really couldn't overstate how great he felt. He didn't realize how much emotional baggage he'd been carrying around lately. Anger, sadness, depression. His very step seemed lighter. He was a dozen meters or so away from the entrance of the arcade when he heard a familiar voice.
Ah, Ryuga!
Akira shouted out of the blue.
Oh, hey,
Ryuga said as Akira ran up towards him.
What are you doing here? I thought you had somewhere to be today,
she asked.
Yeah, I've gone and returned. I decided to stop by and play a few games before I head home.
Oh, really? In that case, I'll come with you, Akira said as she slipped her arm around his before he could react.
Oh, okay, but aren't you here with your friends?
Ryuga asked as he nodded towards the group of people headed their way. Tarad, Benji, Jin, Linda, and two of her friends.
Oh, them? Yeah, but I don't think they'd mind if we cut things short. I've never gotten time to properly talk to you. We're always so rushed at school. I'd actually like to chat with you.
Hey, loser. What are you doing here?
Tarad growled as he drew near, he and his jockstrap squad close behind. Ryuga barely registered his existence, choosing instead to focus on Akira.
Okay then, let's go,
he replied, allowing Akira to lead the way.
Not so fast,
Tarad said, grabbing Ryuga by the shoulder. Unlike their previous scuffle, Ryuga effortlessly shrugged off his grip, which sent Tarad into an even deeper rage.
I'm speaking to you, you little maggot.
Tarad grabbed Ryuga by both shoulders, pushing and pinning him against a nearby pole.
Look at me when I'm talking to you,
Tarad growled.
Tarad, what's wrong with you?
Akira began to protest, but Benji grabbed her by the arm before she could intervene.
Stay out of this, little missy. This is between us men.
Benji gloated.
Men? There's 4 of you and just him. Some men you are.
Akira shouted as she fought in vain to free herself.
Just relax, or you'll hurt yourself, girlie.
Let her go, underling, Ryuga said, completely ignoring Tarad once more.
You little shit!
Tarad screamed as he reared back to punch Ryuga in the face. For some reason, Tarad's movements seemed to play out in slow motion. It was child's play for Ryuga to brush off the attack, which he did with ease. Weak. I'm in a good mood right now. Don't mess it up, Ryuga said calmly as he finally addressed Tarad.
Who the fuck do you think you are?
Tarad shouted, lifting Ryuga off his feet and up by his collar.
Enough! Tarad, stop!
Akira shouted as she clawed and scratched at Benji.
Are you really saying you prefer this orphans company over us?
Linda finally chimed in.
If this is how you are all going to act, yes!
Akira responded without a second thought. Linda glanced over at the situation with Tarad, then back towards Akira's pleading eyes.
Tarad, let him down,
Linda reluctantly said.
No way! I won't be satisfied until I smash this little arrogant fuck's face!
Tarad growled. Yeah, Tarad, let me down. Ryuga repeated, his voice cold and steely. His eyes had taken on a different tone, and Tarad realized something was now amiss.
What the?
Oop, too late. You had your chance, Ryuga said as he grasped both of Tarad's hands and squeezed. The sounds of bones popping immediately filled the air as Tarad's grip faltered and he stumbled backwards. Tarad's face was contorted in pain and disbelief.
What the hell did you just do, you freaking loser?
Benji shouted, finally releasing his grip on Akira as he dashed towards Tarad, who was now writhing on the ground.
Tarad! Oh my god, Tarad!
Linda said as she moved towards the injured boy with a startled expression.
Ryuga?
Akira said, frozen in place as she stared towards Ryuga, who, by all outward appearances, seemed calm. However, she got the impression that he was anything but. In fact, her senses were screaming, suggesting that something terrible was about to happen. Akira had just quickly resolved herself to rush to Ryuga's side when all hell suddenly broke loose. Chapter 5. A Taste of Terror. Akira dashed forward. Her plan was to grab Ryuga by the hand and make a quick escape. Things were quickly spiraling out of control, and they would only get worse at this rate.
Ryuga!
Akira shouted as she moved, hands outstretched. But what she saw was enough to make her blood run cold.
What's that?
Akira said, stopping in her tracks as she pointed towards Ryuga.
You crazy piece of shit! You broke his hands! You just cost the basketball team our shot at nationals!
Benji screamed as he got to his feet. He dashed wildly towards Ryuga, intent on striking the boy with all of his might, but he never made it. Just as the punch was about to make impact, Benji's arm went flying. The spray of blood mist spattered all over both Ryuga as well as Benji. Both struggled to understand exactly what happened, but only one person there realized what was going on.
Oh my god, Ryuga! Ryuga! Come over here, please! Now!
Akira pleaded. Her voice was filled with urgency. She fought to keep her cool, but Ryuga had never heard such a desperate plea from anyone before. He didn't question, nor disobey. Instead, he slowly began to walk away from Benji and move towards Akira.
Hurry, please!
Akira said, her voice restrained to the best of her ability.
Nobody move! Don't move!
Akira said as she finally grabbed Ryuga's hand. Ryuga immediately noticed her eyes, which were wide and had taken on a purple tint. Akira's breathing was wild and unsteady, as if she were fighting to take even breaths.
What?
Benji finally said as he tried to register what happened.
What did you do, you fucking psycho? My arm! You took my arm!
Benji! Benji, stop! Benji!
Akira said loudly, trying desperately to get through to Benji, but it was no use. He was in shock at the fact of having lost his arm. His mind was gone, and all he could manage was rage, anger.
I'm gonna kill you!
Benji shouted as he dashed haphazardly towards Ryuga, and that's when another spray of blood pierced the air. This time Ryuga managed just a glimpse of what happened. It looked as if something invisible had cleaved the air, striking Benji along his back. The young boy immediately flew forward, landing on his face as he skidded along the ground. Portions of his blood stood suspended in the air at first glance, before Ryuga realized the blood spatter was clinging to some sort of invisible creature. He immediately grabbed Akira and pushed her behind him.
Holy shit!
He whispered to himself as he watched the creature's motions. The area he'd been ambushed in had asphalt, dirt, and grass patches nearby. Benji's blood trickled down in thick blots as the creature prowled silently. Having noticed its presence, it was like Ryuga was beginning to sense more and more of the space it occupied.
Can you see it?
Akira whispered, her grip tightening around Ryuga's arm.
Not completely. I mean, I can feel it. I know something's there, but I can't see it.
Ryuga said.
I can.
Akira replied.
It's like a giant dog with scales and huge claws. It looks more like a lizard than anything, and I can tell it's not friendly. It's moving right towards us, Ryuga. We have to get out of here.
Linda, who'd been in shock up until now, had managed to find her voice.
What the fuck is going on?
She screamed, panic heightening her demeanor.
Shh! Don't move if you want to live,
Ryuga commanded.
You did this! What did you do to Benji, you damn psycho?
Linda began to shout and scream as tears streamed down her cheeks, and that's when the creature reacted, lashing out and clawing at her swiftly. The blow was little more than a cat's paw, a playful swipe that any kitten would use to swat away a toy. And yet, the force of the blow both broke Linda's arm and knocked her several dozen feet away. She landed with a hard thud, face down, unconscious. The two girls next to Linda immediately screamed out and turned to run.
Wait, don't leave us!
Jin screamed as he too made an effort to run. Ryuga, Tarid, and the remaining Jockstrap Squad member watched in horror as each of them were mowed down mercilessly. Akira could only watch as the creature bounded towards them, clawing each of her classmates down with ease, sinking its teeth into the boy and cleaving the head from the girl's shoulders.
Help me! Tarid, help!
Jin pleaded as the creature snapped his body in two and tossed his corpse to the side.
I think I'm going to be sick.
Ryuga gasped between gulps. Akira was too scared to move, paralyzed by the sight before her.
Where is it?
Ryuga asked, but Akira wouldn't speak, as if her voice was trapped in her throat.
Akira!
Ryuga repeated desperately, but to no avail. Akira's only response was to whimper, and by then it was too late. Ryuga could feel the heat from the creature's breath as it bared down upon them. His mind was now racing. With Akira paralyzed from fear and half the people here torn to shreds, was there anything he could do to survive the situation? Based on how quickly the creature pounced upon its classmates, there would be no way to escape. Perhaps if they could run inside, but even that seemed impossible.
Damn it, just when my life was getting good.
Ryuga thought to himself as he clenched his fist.
Akira, I want you to run and don't look back,
he said as he mentally prepared himself for what came next.
Ryuga, I can't. My legs won't move. I'm so scared,
Akira said, tears streaming down her cheeks as she buried her face into the middle of his back.
It's okay. I just need to hold it off for a few minutes. If you can run towards a building, I think you can do it, he whispered.
Heat from the creature's body revealed just how close the invisible threat had come.
3, 2...
Ryuga!
Akira whimpered.
Go!
Ryuga shouted as he dashed forward with all of his might. Based on his observation of the creature's footprints and the blood spatter, Ryuga believed the creature's face to be in a certain area. He would bet his life on a single strike to blind his foe. To this end, he slipped out of his jacket within the first few steps and lunged forward, burying his fist where he believed the creature's eye to be. His estimate was rewarded as he felt his fist strike something soft, no doubt his target. As he felt the creature lurch and thrash, next Ryuga tossed his overcoat over what he assumed to be the creature's face. With this, he felt satisfied in buying Akira enough time to escape. He turned to run himself, only to realize Akira had never moved. She was frozen in place, too petrified with fear to even flee.
Akira!
Ryuga reached out to the young girl, only to be swatted hard by the creature's massive claw. Ryuga could feel the wind knocked out of him as large, sharp claws dug into its body and lifted him off his feet. For a moment, all he could see was the clouds as Ryuga spiraled upwards into the sky and landed on the ground with a hard thud. As the injured young man fought to breathe, all he could do was behold the sight before him. Somehow, the creature's camouflage had been undone. Its left eye was bleeding profusely from his strike, and much like Akira described, the creature looked like a very large dog in some aspects. Unlike a dog, however, it was covered in greenish-blue scales which resembled armor plating more than anything else. The creature's reptilian face reminded him of a dragon, at least what a dragon could be imagined to look like. Its other black and red eyeball focused on Ryuga for just a moment before turning its attention towards Akira.
No!
Ryuga thought to himself. He tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come out. No doubt one of his lungs might be punctured. All strength escaped him as he watched the creature begin to draw closer to Akira, skulking towards her, its intent to kill made plain for all to see. Akira could do little else but stand planted in fear, her arms covering her face as she sobbed.
Akira, I'm sorry. I don't have the strength. I can't do anything. I can't.
It was around this time that Ryuga's memories began to replay in his mind. During this time of distress, he thought about his mother most of all. Perhaps it was being on the verge of death that unlocked the memory. Or perhaps it was the desperation he felt. Ryuga began to recall, in detail, the night his mother died. The images came in flashes, and one thing that stood out to him was a silhouette skulking in the darkness. Jaws which closed around his mother as her arms stretched out to his, her face as she shoved him away and the creature dragged her away into the night. A creature that looked just like...
You. It was you!
Ryuga said as he got to his feet, tears streaming down his face.
You killed her!
Ryuga could feel his control slipping. It was as if a great power was flowing into him, consuming and swallowing him whole. The immensity of it was comparable to a vast ocean of stars. Suddenly, Ryuga was in a dark, empty place, foreign, yet familiar. He glanced around, unsure as to what actually happened, and after a few seconds, he realized that he wasn't alone.
You're not supposed to be here yet.
A child's voice said, causing Ryuga to turn around. There, in the midst of all the darkness, was a young boy. He looked to be no more than 6 or 7 years of age. Unlike most children, 2 small horns protruded from the navy blue hair which covered his head. He was dressed in something out of an old martial arts film, like something a monk would wear. The moment he laid eyes upon the small child behind him, the kid leapt upwards and plucked Ryuga's forehead. In that instant, he felt an immense force pushing him backwards. It felt as if he was being forced through the cosmos, as an intense pulling sensation drew him back to his senses. And just like that, he was standing next to Akira again, confused.
Ryuga, are you okay? Are you back?
Akira said, a look of concern on her face as tears streamed down her cheeks.
What happened? Where is it?
He said, frantically gazing around. It was then that Ryuga noticed the creature lying in a heap on the ground, several meters from where he and Akira were now standing.
What? I don't understand what's going on.
Ryuga said as Akira rushed to hug him, burying her face in his chest, a sign of her relief. Ryuga searched his mind for any recollection of the missing time, but he couldn't recall anything. Akira was in no state to answer, and it seemed the danger had passed.
I was so worried. You looked so angry.
Akira said suddenly as she gazed up at Ryuga. Ryuga began, but he faltered when he saw the look of concern in her eyes. He recognized the meaning of that look so long ago from his own experiences. It was the look of someone who was scared of losing something precious.
I'm sorry,
Ryuga said. It seemed appropriate, although he couldn't quite piece together why. The two shared a long moment in which they simply stood, embracing each other. It would have been quite nice if it weren't for the blood and death surrounding them. Still, he felt he owed it to Akira in some way, so he continued to indulge her. Ryuga couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. After a few moments, his senses proved accurate.
It's not dead!
An injured Tarad screamed as he struggled to get to his feet and run away.
What?
Ryuga shouted, once more placing Akira behind him. Indeed, the creature had now wobbled to its feet and was moving towards them, or at least attempting to do so. There was a large chunk of flesh which appeared to have been clawed out, missing from its side. It was all the creature could do to crawl towards them.
Let's get away from here,
Ryuga said as he took Akira by the hand. The two began to run, but by then it was too late. The creature, sensing that they might try to flee, had already prepared its final surprise. It began to glow, enveloped in a bright white light as electricity began to surge and crackle across its skin. In an instant, this light expanded into a massive sphere of light, capturing everything around it within its influence. In the blink of an eye, they had both been swallowed by the creature's devious blow. Chapter 6. Gone Too Soon.
I know that the past 2 weeks have been a roller coaster ride for all of us. I just want to thank everyone in the homeroom class who contributed to the care package. I'll be going to deliver this to your classmates who were involved in the incident later this afternoon,
Miss Konami said as she looked out across her class. The students' faces had grown sullen, serious, but such was to be expected given everything that happened. Nearly 1/4 of the classroom disappeared in a day. Anyone would have a hard time coping with something like that. Miss Konami continued on, speaking to her students about valor in times of heartache and the importance of speaking about their emotions. The truth was, she hadn't even fully come to terms with her own feelings on the incident. It was something unexplainable, with no clear answers and only sorrow. Even for her, as a teacher, there was a degree of anxiety every time she thought about the faces of those students she would no longer see. Many of them she felt needed attitude adjustments. She couldn't count the number of times she wanted to lecture or strangle half of them, but all that seemed so pointless now. She finished her speech just as the bell rang, and she plastered on her best smile of comfort as she watched each student leave the classroom. There on her desk were 2 rather large gift baskets filled with various items: books, cards, candles, flowers, and fruits, both filled to the brim, symbolizing condolences and well wishes from the classroom.
This might be a lot harder than I thought,
Miss Konami whispered to herself. There was no telling how long she stood at her podium, her thoughts carrying her away, but the voice of another teacher quickly pulled her back to reality.
Kaid, are you okay?
It was the voice of the teacher from 3B next door, Mr. Grimm.
Ah, yes. Sorry, I was just spacing out a bit. I'm fine. Thanks, Jonathan.
I see.
Did you need something?
Miss Konami asked as she walked over towards her desk and put away her lesson planner.
Oh, I was actually curious if you wanted some company. You know, for your visit to the hospital.
Mr. Grimm mentioned as he closely scanned Kaid Konami for some sort of distress or repressed emotional trauma.
That's very thoughtful. Normally I'd take you up on that offer, but I've heard that both of my students have been exhibiting extreme trauma. The doctors have only allowed 1 person to visit, and only for a short while. It seems neither can really handle it.
Oh, wow. Mr. Grimm seemed genuinely concerned.
Well, I'm here. You know, if you ever just want to talk.
He nodded, lingering in the doorway for a few moments longer before departing.
Thanks, Jonathan,
Konami said softly as she stared down at the care baskets. It wasn't long before Miss Konami made it to the Gardenvale Hospital, where 2 of her students were currently being held. The car ride was short, but the time was enough for Kaid to steel herself for what she had to do. She needed answers. She needed to make sense of the situation, to understand why, and for that, she would need to push 2 broken youths. As with all things delicate, if too much pressure is applied, they tend to break. Miss Konami knew this, having suffered losses herself, but only these 2 students were present at the scene. With 3 of her students presumed dead or missing, 6 in the morgue, and only 2 survivors, she simply had to have a clearer understanding of what transpired. Miss Konami took a deep breath as she stood before the doors to the hospital, staring up at the 4-story building before her. The sky seemed strangely somber, as if nature itself moved to match the mood of the day. Internally, she was beginning to panic. Was this really right? Why would she, a teacher, be able to glean information that the law could not? Either way, she would have to deliver the class gifts, but she found herself desperately searching her logic for a reason to defy the flickering fire of anger within her heart.
These are my students. They are my responsibility. Why did something like this happen? Did I let a situation go too far that I should have reined in? I need to know.
Her motivations defied all logic, and so she steeled her heart and resolved to do what was necessary. Soon she was on the 4th floor, where both students were being kept. Miss Konami couldn't help but notice the twinge of pity and sadness on the nurse's face as Kaid mentioned which rooms she'd be visiting. Was it really that bad? Had Kaid not prepared herself properly for this? Either way, she was here, no turning back. As she came to room 403, Miss Konami found herself biting her own lip out of sheer nerves. The door was open, and from her position in the hallway, Konami could see the young girl in the bed, staring out of the window. There was a gentle breeze blowing, perhaps the only comforting thing about the visage. Linda looked so frail, so weak, as if she could float away on the wind. Her right arm was completely covered in cast. The treatment had even extended to her shoulder blade as well. Linda's normally vibrant skin was pale. Her blonde hair seemed to have taken on a grayish tint now that Miss Konami got a proper look at her.
Linda?
Miss Konami said softly as she walked just inside the doorway. For a time, Linda didn't seem to notice, but eventually she turned to face her teacher.
Miss Konami,
Linda said with a faint smile.
when did you get here?
She asked.
Oh, just now. It hasn't been long. May I sit with you for a while? I brought you some things.
Miss Konami added as she stepped into the room. She had no intention of being dismissed regardless of what Linda said, but the young girl made no protest. Miss Konami had no clue where to begin. She'd been in contact with a few friends who worked in the hospital. For the most part, she understood the state of both of her students to a degree, but seeing it was a whole different matter. It was as if Linda was a shell of her former self. It was here that Konami struggled to really breach the subject with her student. She had absolutely no way to ask what she wanted to know. Instead, she decided to test the waters. She began by showing Linda the items in the care package and reading cards from all of her classmates. It was here that Miss Konami was hit with a bit of unexpected truth.
They're such good people, even though I was rotten. And I treated most of them like shit.
Linda responded without a sign of emotion. Miss Konami could do little else but to agree. After all, it was no secret that Linda was indeed the Queen Bee, and the B did not stand for B. Still, since Linda seemed to be in an honest mood, Miss Konami saw it as her chance to venture further towards her goal.
Linda, as you may know, I was Ryuga's guardian while he lived here in Gardenvale.
At the mention of Ryuga's name, Miss Konami immediately felt the mood change, as if Linda had withdrawn into herself.
Mm-hmm.
Linda replied, her voice low and monotone.
I'm not angry at you. I understand how high school can be. I was young once. I get the group dynamics. I just need a better understanding of what happened that day, or what was going on between all of the students that could have caused...
Miss Konami grew quiet, desperately searching for the words, but none seemed to come. Instead, Linda began to speak.
Tarad, he liked Akira. But it was one-sided. He used to like me too. Really, Tarad likes every new girl. Or rather, he likes what he can get from them. And I suppose that made me a little jealous.
Linda said. Her gaze had returned to the open window.
So, Tarad roughed Ryuga up a little. He was supposed to be out of school for a few days, based on what they said, but he came to school the next day like nothing happened. That really pissed Tarad off.
I see. I mean, I was aware that Akira was interested in Ryuga, but was it mutual?
Linda was quiet for a few moments before she continued.
It's really funny. It's like, sometimes you don't really see the good parts of people until someone else takes notice. After Akira told me she thought Ryuga was interesting, something inside me, I just wanted to...
Tears began to run down Linda's cheeks.
I'm a terrible person, Miss Konami. I got what I deserved.
Linda said through her tears as she fought to wipe away the large round beads flowing down her cheek.
No, Linda. If there's anything I know, it's that growing up is hard, even for adults. Learning to manage your emotions is challenging.
It was here Miss Konami got to her feet and gently hugged the young girl, pulling Linda to her bosom as she did so. It was a few moments longer before Linda continued speaking.
So, we all went to the arcade. It was nice until Ryuga showed up. Then things just happened so fast, I I don't know.
Yes, and that's the part I want to ask you about. But Linda, I really need to stress that I don't want you to feel like you have to say anything you don't feel comfortable with, no matter what happened, okay?
Linda nodded. Her flowing tears seemed to calm down a bit.
So, as much as you can, please tell me what happened.
Miss Konami said as she moved to the opposite side of Linda's hospital bed to better comfort her. What transpired next left Miss Konami with a range of emotions that she wasn't sure how to process. For a few moments, she felt the incredible story might be an elaborate lie. But as she searched Linda's face, Kaid quickly realized that was impossible. The thoughts, the words were all raw and unfiltered, as if a dam had finally broken within Linda. At times, Miss Konami found it difficult to breathe. Her eyes widened as Linda recounted her perception of the events. Finally, the young girl broke down sobbing once more as she completed her tale.
I'm so sorry.
Linda kept repeating through her heaving sobs, as if she had a hand directly in the carnage.
Linda.
Miss Konami's voice felt caught in her throat, tears in her eyes as she spoke.
It's okay. What happened wasn't your fault. It's okay. Shh.
Kaid repeated as she consoled the bawling teenager. It would be another 15 minutes of tears before Linda calmed down enough to speak again.
I tried to run. I thought that Ryuga was the one doing all those terrible things. But it wasn't him. Something attacked me. I don't know what it was. I couldn't really see it, but I felt it.
Linda's eyes seemed to glow out of focus as she remembered sustaining her injuries.
Hey, Linda, it's okay. That's enough. Thank you for telling me. You've been very brave. And just so you know, terrible people don't do what you just did. Being better is a choice we all have to make at some point in our lives. You've got your whole life ahead of you to turn things around, okay?
Miss Konami said as she patted the young girl on her cheek. It would be a few more minutes still before Linda settled down enough for Miss Konami to say her goodbyes. As she left the room, Miss Kaid looked back once more at her pupil. If it were possible, the girl seemed even smaller than before, like a wraith on the wind as she stared out into the distance at the setting sun.
My God, what happened?
Miss Konami mouthed to herself as she stepped into the hall, barely exiting the door before she began to buckle.
Sliced to pieces? Bitten? The police and news didn't say anything about this.
Miss Konami felt herself growing lightheaded as she set the other gift basket down and hurried towards the restroom. Miss Konami checked her watch as she gazed into the bathroom mirror. She'd washed all of her foundation off in a panic as she splashed water over her face to prevent nausea. The more she thought about Linda's tale, the more she realized it was true. The mass funeral, all closed caskets, the families and the depths of their grieving, the police presence ushering everyone away who got a little too close, even Linda's injury. But what could possibly cause an injury like that? A lion? Or bear?
But Linda said it was invisible. Maybe it was just too fast for her to see.
Miss Konami struggled to wrap her head around the story. There was really only one way to further confirm what Linda said is true. She would need to speak to Tarad. She dried her face as best she could, reapplied some light foundation and fixed her lipstick, then retrieved the care package and continued down the hall to room 418. Tarad's hospital room was all the way at the end of the hallway, and posted out front were two people. Upon closer inspection, they seemed to be law enforcement. Neither made a motion to stop her as she approached, but as she moved to open the door, she was halted.
Excuse me, Miss Konami, is it?
One of the young men guarding the door began. He motioned for her to step over to the side so they could speak.
Hello, I'm Officer Mori. I was wondering if I could ask you a few questions about a couple of your students.
Hi, officer. Perhaps. Which students are you referring to?
Miss Konami inquired.
Well, as you know, there were 9 people involved in a high-profile incident. Of those 9, only 2 survived, but their stories are a bit...
I see. Well, they've been through a considerable amount of trauma.
Of course. It's not just that. We were hoping that maybe with your position as a teacher,
You might be able to get your students to open up more easily than we or their parents could.
I see. And if that's possible, you'd like me to share that info with you?
Miss Konami replied. Her face was pleasant, but in the back of her mind, she could only imagine Linda's description of Benji's arm being severed. Yes, exactly. We'd greatly appreciate your help on that matter. But truth be told, that's not the only reason I pulled you aside. Officer Mori continued. You see, Tarrant has developed a very extreme case of PTSD and possible schizophrenia. He believes that shadow creatures are lurking, coming for him at any time. Because of this, the only way to keep him calm is to have round-the-clock security.
That's...
Miss Konami seemed at a loss for words. It's extreme, but considering that he's one of the only living witnesses of what may have happened, we have to make every effort to accommodate his mental health. So when you go inside, please, be gentle. He's very excitable. Kai didn't know what to say. She was left speechless. Officer Mori patted her on the shoulder, then bowed as he gestured for her to enter. He nodded to his partner, who opened the door for her.
Tarrant, your homeroom teacher, Miss Konami, is here to see you,
the other officer announced, then nodded for Konami to enter. As the door opened before her, she immediately noticed a stark contrast to Linda's room, which was open and well lit. Tarrant's hospital room was completely dark. The normally thin curtains had been replaced with thick drapes designed to repel all light.
Miss Konami, hurry up and come in before they follow you.
Tarrant's voice came from the far corner of the room. It took a moment for Miss Konami's eyes to adjust to the dim environs, but then she noticed the boy huddled in a corner. Only a sliver of light pierced the window, and even that seemed too much for Tarrant. The officers closed the door behind her, and for the first time, she realized that even the glass pane had been covered with construction paper.
Tarrant?
Miss Konami said, suddenly feeling uneasy.
Shh, come closer.
Tarrant whispered. What else could she do but obey in this instance? She walked as quietly as she could, setting the gift basket down at her feet before taking a seat next to the young boy on the floor. As she drew near, she realized that both Tarrant's hands were set in a cast, dozens of small pins protruding from both.
Tarrant, you should be in bed with those injuries,
Miss Konami whispered disapprovingly. Her nurturing instincts kicked in.
I can't touch the light. If I touch the light, it'll get me, just like it got everyone else,
he said.
But I like you. I have to save you. I couldn't save them. I couldn't do anything for them, but I can save you, Miss Konami.
Tarrant, what happened to your hands?
Kaid asked, already knowing the answer from Linda's recounting of the incident.
Oh, this? It's nothing. Ryuga and I had a squabble. It's nothing.
Tarrant seemed utterly unfazed, despite the fact that his hands had been completely crushed.
So, Ryuga did this to you?
Miss Konami continued, placing her hands gently against Tarrant's.
Well, yes, but it was my fault. I started. But Ryuga, he saved me. He saved us.
He did? So you boys worked out your issues?
Yes, we had to. Otherwise, it would get us all.
Tarrant's very childlike way of speaking suggested to Miss Konami that he might be mentally shielding himself from the truth. Still, she needed to know. She'd come this far. There was no turning back.
Tarrant, tell me everything that happened, okay? Everything, and don't leave any details out.
Tarrant nodded obediently, as he then pulled her closer and began to whisper to her, recounting his experiences during the incident.
At first, I thought it was Ryuga, but it wasn't. It was a dragon. It was attacking us one by one, but it was invisible. We couldn't see it. But Akira could. And then...
Tarrant paused, seemingly remembering the fate of his slain classmates.
But Ryuga, he fought it. He hit it so hard it fell on its side. I thought it was dead, but it came back to life. And then I ran. I'm sorry. I left them.
Tarrant whispered, tears in his eyes. Miss Konami's breathing had grown more heavy as she struggled to listen to Tarrant's retelling of the story. For a moment, she forgot where she was and accidentally bumped the care basket with her foot.
What was that?
Tarad said with a start.
Shh. It's coming back for me. Just like it killed everybody else. I know it. Miss Konami, come here. I'll protect you. I swear I will this time.
Tarad grabbed his teacher and pulled her close, completely ignoring the pain searing through his shattered hands. The drive home was a long, quiet affair for Miss Konami. Seeing two people she'd known for years in such a state was too much for anyone. Bodies can heal given enough time, but wounds to the mind and the psyche may never truly recover. As she thought about what she'd heard and seen, she felt no closer to understanding the fate of her students. Dragons? Invisible creatures with razor-sharp claws? It was clear to her that both Linda and Tarad had seen something terrible. And what of Akira and Ryuga? The more she thought about it, the deeper the mystery became until finally Mrs. Konami decided to turn her car around. She was minutes from her home, but the swirling torrent of emotion prompted her to take a longer drive. Due to his Aunt Samiko's wishes, Ryuga's gravesite was in the nearby town of Greenvale. It was here that Miss Konami found herself drawn as night fell. It wasn't long before she stood in front of Ryuga's grave, which sat next to that of his mother. As she stared down at it, she was filled with a wave of regret and sadness. Why?
Miss Konami began, tears streaming down her face.
Why is it always you? Just when I thought you'd finally made a friend. Your father's dead. Your mother, too. You tried so hard to get by. I know you did. I noticed it. So why?
Miss Konami broke down as she sank to her knees, tears streaming from her eyes as she wept silently for a good long while.
Dear God, if there is such a thing, please let Ryuga have a measure of happiness, wherever he is.
Miss Konami prayed as she finally dried her eyes. She bowed her head to the trio of headstones once more, one for Ryuga, his mother, and his father. Finally, she made her way to her vehicle, a somber wind carrying away the last of her tears. Chapter 7. The Squirrel Girl Sensei. Her feline ears perked up at the sound of commotion. She couldn't immediately place the sound, but it was enough to spark her curiosity. She placed a fistful of herbs and roots into her waist pack, and then decided to take a break from the boring tasks of flora hunting.
A little bit of adventure,
She said to herself with a smile as her tail curled slightly. Soon, the Nekomata was dashing through the forest, and a few moments later, she was faced with a sight she'd never seen.
What is it? It smells strange.
She sniffed the creature lying before her. She could tell it was still alive, unconscious by the sound of its rhythmic breathing.
I wonder what Sensei would say about me bringing home some strange humanoid.
The cat girl put her hand up to her chin in thought for a few moments as she cocked her head to and fro. Ultimately, she decided,
Why not?
She scooped up the curious humanoid creature and hoisted it over her shoulder effortlessly. Its tattered clothes reeked of fresh grass and blood. Soon, the young cat girl was off. Her quick, agile movements were a thing of wonder, even while carrying an unconscious passenger. As he opened his eyes, Ryuga could feel his body revolting against him. It had been a while since he felt so sore, so drained. His body felt heavy, as if he'd used all of his energy to the brink. It took him a few moments to open his eyes, but the first thing he noticed was a thatched roof, seemingly made of straw no less. It took a moment for him to realize that he was in a foreign environment. He pulled himself up with a great deal of effort, nearly rolling off the makeshift straw mattress where he lay. It would be a few moments more before he could manage to stand on his own 2 feet.
Why does my body feel so heavy?
He whispered to himself. It was time for some self-assessment. Ryuga took note of the state of his body. His clothes were ripped, shredded in some places. His school uniform was in tatters, smeared with dirt and caked with blood. No doubt the blood of Benji or his other classmates. His limbs seemed okay, nothing injured or broken, and though his body felt sluggish, his mind was clear. After a few deep breaths, he took in the environment. a hut by all appearances, with 2 straw cots in separate corners. The place was tidy, and it seemed well lived in, though there were no signs of anyone but himself.
Where the heck am I?
Ryuga said aloud. It took some time to move towards the door of the hut, which seemed to be made of a bamboo-like wood.
Very rustic,
he thought to himself as he stepped outside. Nearby the straw hut, there was a fire going, a metal pot set up to boil just over the dancing flames. Whatever was in the pot smelled fragrant enough to cause his stomach to rumble, a signal that Ryuga may have been out longer than he thought. As he looked around, he realized he was in a forest, though it didn't resemble any place he'd ever been, or seen for that matter. The sounds of life began to come into focus as he stared out into the distance, slim trees towering all around. By the look of things, the time of day was afternoon. After wandering a few steps from the hut, Ryuga began to shout.
Hello? Akira?
He screamed. Considering his last recollection, he was hoping that Akira would be nearby, but to no avail. After several minutes of screaming and listening for a response, he decided to move deeper into the forest in search of his classmate. After traveling several meters from the hut, Ryuga's attention was drawn towards the sound of thuds and shouts. His first thought was that Akira was being attacked by yet another creature, so he summoned what little strength he had to break into a dash.
Akira! Akira, can you hear me? Akira!
He shouted repeatedly as he pushed through the forest, branches and brushes slapping against him as he moved. Soon he found himself approaching the nearby commotion, his mind racing with the worst of misgivings as he burst into the clearing.
Akira!
For a moment, Ryuga didn't realize what was happening. Before him, he saw 2 humanoid figures locked in battle. One resembled a very short, or perhaps rather large, squirrel. The other looked like a cat girl, complete with neko ears, claws, and a tail. The 2 seemed much too focused on their battle to take note of Ryuga, who simply stood there, mouth agape. Their movements seemed supersonic to Ryuga, who could do little else but take in as much as he could from the battle. It seemed as if the cat girl had an upper hand. She was much more aggressive with her strikes. Looks were deceiving, though. It took just one connecting strike from the squirrel-like humanoid in order to down the feline.
Hello?
Ryuga said, finally grabbing the attention of the 2 humanoid creatures before him. The cat girl immediately got to her feet, dusting off her clothes in one quick motion. Likewise, the squirrel eyed Ryuga curiously, then pointed to the cat girl as it spoke. While Ryuga could tell the 2 were conversing, he couldn't understand a word being said. It was a completely different language than anything he'd ever heard, and definitely not human.
Can you understand me?
Ryuga said, taking a slow step backwards. The cat girl smiled as she bounced towards him, breaking out into a leaping pounce. In response, Ryuga could do little else but try to run, but to no avail. She easily pinned him down to the ground and used her full weight to restrict his movements. As Ryuga struggled to free himself, the squirrel-like humanoid walked towards him, one hand behind its back and the other outstretched. For a moment, Ryuga felt a tingling sensation. It was as if the hairs on the back of his neck all began to stand on end. Then, no sooner had the sensation passed, a small orb of white energy appeared near the fingertip of the approaching creature. Suffering from flashbacks of his encounter with the dragon creature, Ryuga struggled even more violently.
Nya!
The cat girl said as she forced him down even harder, making it so that he couldn't move, let alone breathe. Ryuga was forced to watch as the small white orb floated towards his face, eventually melting into his forehead. The sensation was like a cool chill, which washed over his mind, sending tingles to every corner of his brain.
What about now?
Ryuga opened his eyes to a strange voice.
You should be able to understand now.
The feminine voice said.
Hey, you're holding him too tight. Get off, Parisia.
The squirrel-like humanoid said as she waved her hands in a shoe motion.
But it was fun. Sorry, I got carried away, Sensei.
the cat girl said as she hopped backwards, landing on all fours as she watched Ryuga intently.
You can speak, right? I've never seen a creature quite like you. You can understand what I'm saying, right?
The squirrel lady said impatiently as she watched Ryuga sit up. Yes, he finally said, rubbing his chest.
Ah, good. I was worried I'd lost my touch, or that you're a dullard.
The squirrel lady laughed as she spoke. She seemed very pleased with her stupid joke. I have so many questions. I have no idea where to begin, really. Ryuga said as he sat down before the two creatures. They didn't seem all that dangerous. Though he quickly realized escape would be impossible, it might be better to use words at this point.
You may ask.
The squirrel lady said, placing both of her hands behind her back as she spoke. She could be no taller than 3 feet even, but her puffy, billowing tail reached slightly higher behind her back. By contrast, the cat girl was around the same height as Akira. Where am I? Ryuga began.
Nope, there's something you've forgotten first. Have you no manners, smelly creature?
The squirrel replied, dismissing his question. Ryuga squinted his eyes, confused by her response.
Introduce yourself, Stinky.
The cat girl said as she watched Ryuga intently. I'm sorry. I did forget my manners. My name is Ryuga. May I have your names?
Imelda. This is my student, Parisia.
The squirrel lady known as Imelda responded. Hello. Can I assume you two were the ones who brought me to this place? Ryuga then asked.
This one did. You should thank her. She found you in the nearby forest a few days ago.
Days? I've been out that long?
Seems so. Mind telling us what you were doing in the middle of a dangerous place like this? Passed out all by your lonesome?
Imelda then asked. I wasn't alone. I was with someone. A girl by the name of Akira. She's shorter than Parisia here. Dark hair and unique eyes. Have you by chance seen her anywhere? Imelda glanced over at Parisia, who seemed to be lost in thought before replying.
Nope. And there you have it.
Imelda replied. Damn it. I have to find her. If this area is dangerous and she's all alone, I definitely have to find her. Ryuga said as he began to get to his feet.
Well, I can understand the desire for you to look for your friend, but I don't think it's possible for you.
Imelda said as she began to size up Ryuga. She stepped forward and peered at him very closely. Ryuga noticed the retina of her eyes. Each was slightly different.
Yep, you definitely die. You're weak. Super weak.
Imelda said a few moments later, turning her back to Ryuga. That may be true, but no matter what, I absolutely must go. Could you please take me to the place you found me?
If this girl, Akira, was anywhere near the area where we found you, I believe Parisia would have found her as well. She has pretty uncanny senses as a Nikomata.
Imelda said casually.
But if you insist.
Imelda continued, turning to face Ryuga once more.
There are a few things we need to do first. We'll head back to my home. Follow me, Ryuga.
Parisia and Imelda began to walk back the way Ryuga had come. Reluctantly, he followed, his mind racing as to the fate of Akira.
Confectionery treats for such a young huntress.